From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the African and Middle East Division of the Library of Congress and to the Persian Book Lecture Series with the 2015 focus on philosophy in Persia. Today's lecture, Embodying the Beloved, Homoeroticism and Embodiment in Medieval Sufism by Matthew Thomas Miller, is sponsored by the Near East section of the African and Middle East Division and the Roshan Institute for Persian Studies at the University of Maryland. As Harad said, I'm Joan Weeks, acting head of the section, and on behalf of all my colleagues, and in particular Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, the chief of the division, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. Before we start today's program, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the division and its resources in the hopes that you'll return and use our collections for your research in this fantastic reading room. The division is comprised of 3 sections that build and serve the collections to researchers from around the world. We cover 78 countries and more than 35 languages. The Africa section includes the countries of all sub-Saharan Africa. The Hebraic section is responsible for Judaica and Hebraica worldwide. And the Near East section covers all of the Arab countries, including North Africa, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Muslims in Western China, Russia and the Balkans, and the peoples of the Caucasus. So you can see it's a very wide scope. Now it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Fatima Kashavadis, who's director of the School of Languages, Literature, and Cultures at the University of Maryland, and she'll introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. Greetings, everybody. Welcome. It's the middle of a working day. I can see a wonderful presence from University of Maryland, but also many of you have left your work to be here for this occasion. So welcome and thank you so much. These series have come out of a major exhibit which we had here, 1,000 Years of the Persian Book, and in collaboration with the Library of Congress, actually Roshan Institute for Persian Studies, and our role was doing this speaker series, organizing the speaker series that went with it, and we had wonderful attendance and amazing speakers. So we're delighted that the library has once more given us the pleasure and the honor of working together on continuing this series. Today, our speaker, Matthew Thomas Miller, is a Roshan Institute Fellow and an Associate Director of the Roshan Initiative for Persian Digital Project in Humanities. I have known Matthew very well for at least the past 10 years when he first took a class on Rumi, or mystical lyrics, with me. And from there on, it was search for Arabic and Persian and mystical literature and writing wonderful pieces of translation and scholarship as well. But on the way, so he started his PhD program at that time in the comparative literature program at Washington University in St. Louis. What Matt also did that is often probably not usual for every PhD program was that he did an intensive certification in translation, which since they couldn't do 2 certificates, I don't think he completed it formally, and then he did a certification in women and gender studies, which I think has given him tremendous range in terms of what he would do with Persian literature. I'm going to let him speak and tell you about his work, but let me just say that the title of his PhD thesis is The Poetics of the Sufi Carnival, the Rogue Lyrics of Sanai, Attar, and Iraqi. And it's a wonderfully colorful but very deep analysis of this counter space which existed as Kharabat, or the dilapidated wine house that had tremendously significant literary and social functions. So today he will speak to us about homoeroticism and embodiment in medieval Sufism. Sorry, eyes in distance. Please welcome Matthew to the table.
Let me thank Dr. Keshalvars for that very warm introduction. And let me also thank Hira and Mary Jane and Joan for inviting me to speak here today. The Library of Congress is one of the greatest centers for learning and cultural preservation in the world, and it is truly an honor to be here today. It's not every day that you get the opportunity to address such a distinguished crowd in a venue that's virtually sacred space for researchers all over the world. So I'm very grateful for that. Today, I will be talking about homoeroticism and embodiment in medieval Sufism. I'm interested in embodying the beloved, as the title of my talk says, and drawing out the implications of embodiment for our understanding of medieval poetry, spirituality, and, as I will focus on today, sexuality studies. Out of interest of time, I will focus primarily on a series of stories from the Hagiography of the famous 13th century Persian Sufi poet Fakhreddin Iraqi. His conversion to the Qalandar's antinomian mode of Islamic mystical piety at the hands of a beautiful young Qalandari boy, a Pesar, is one of the most emblematic stories of Sufi homoeroticism in Persian Sufi literature. According to the widely cited anonymous biography of Iraqi, which is basically reproduced throughout most of his hagiographic biographical tradition, one day as Iraqi was teaching the traditional Islamic sciences in a madrasa in Hamadan, a wild band of Qalandars rushed into his assembly, disturbing not only the day's lesson and the orderly piety of its congregants, but indeed the very core of Iraqi's being. Suddenly, a group of Qalandars arrived and entered the assembly with all of their merry commotion. They began to do sama and sing a ghazal. When the Qalandars had finished their song and recited their ghazal, Iraqi was seized with an internal turmoil. Amongst the Qalandars, he saw a boy who was without peer in beauty and was desirable to the heart of lovers, a beauty such that if a Chinese painter saw his waving ringlet, he would have been bewildered. He saw that royal falcon, the youth, again, and the bird of his heart fell in the trap of love, and the fire of loving desire burnt up his rationality. He took off his garments and turban and gave them to the Qalandars and recited this ghazal. Che khosh bashad ke del daram to bashi, nadimu munesu yaram to bashi. Ze shadi dar hame alam nagunjam, agar yek lahze gam kharam to bashi. How wonderful it would be if you were my sweetheart, my intimate friend, companion, and beloved. The whole world could not contain me in this joyful state, if for but one moment you would be my bosom buddy. His state of being transformed and overtaken with yearning for this beautiful youth, the anecdote continues with Iraqi setting out to find him and forsaking his family and high position in the socio-religious hierarchy of the native Hamadan. He eventually reunites with his beloved and, quote, spends all his time loving that boy before their fateful separation in a large storm on their trip from Delhi to Somnath. This story, which is repeated in most later accounts of Iraqi's life, is exceedingly clear on the primary impetus for Iraqi's dramatic internal transformation and conversion to the Qalandari way. It is one beautiful young male member of the Qalandari group in particular who has caught his eye and unleashed the transformative fires of love. It is he who he chases and, quote, spends all his time loving. The reader of William Chittick and Peter Wilson's classical rendering of this story would never know this, however. The figure of the beautiful youth is completely scrubbed from their Bowdlerized version, and Iraqi's love is transposed onto a collective object pronoun them, which refers to the entire Qalandar band. Iraqi is, quote, overcome with longing for the Qalandar group, we are told in their heteronormative makeover of this strongly homoerotic story. Moreover, their decision to de-eroticize the story of Eraqi's conversion to the Qalandari path is not an isolated incident in their rendition of Eraqi's Hagiography. They systematically eliminate any homoerotic features of the original text. All such stories are excised from their version or substantially altered in order to, quote, straighten them. Chittick and Wilson's refusal to treat the numerous homoerotic anecdotes contained in Eraqi's biography on their own terms is not unique, however. It is a particularly egregious example of a more widespread tendency in modern scholarship on Sufism and Sufi literature to desexualize, allegorize, and/or decidedly straighten manifestations of homoeroticism for more comfortable consumption by contemporary, largely heteronormative audiences. The ways in which this process of heteronormativization is accomplished varies, and in some cases it is more obvious than others. Chittick and Wilson take more liberties than most. Completely eliminating and radically transforming sections of the original text are not the most common techniques. Others, however, engage in similar practices aimed at obscuring or attenuating queerness in less obvious and seemingly less harmless ways. There is, for example, the popular practice of rendering the often masculine poetic figure of the beloved in Persian lyric and the nasib of Persian odes with feminine instead of masculine English pronouns. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are distinguished Iranian intellectuals and even some contemporary academics that have not shied away from highlighting non-heteronormative forms of desire in Sufi literature, but do so only with what seems to them an obligatory denunciation of it. However, perhaps the most telling sign of heteronormativity's distorting influence on medieval Persian studies is the general lack of disciplinary interest in these topics until quite recently. While space does not permit me a full review of this literature here, these different techniques for dealing with uncomfortable forms of desire are what Karma Lockery calls the heterosexual paradigms of scholarship. They are examples of the protocols and proprieties that Lauren Berlant and Michael Werner argue reproduce an invisible heteronormativity and structure interpretive strategies, modes of analysis, and hierarchies of disciplinary priorities in the modern academy. The rise of sexuality studies and queer theory in the last several decades was a direct response to this exclusionary regime of power knowledge. The diverse range of studies associated with these fields has sought to unsettle, dismantle, denaturalize heterosexuality and its academic corollaries through a, quote, recovery of cultural meanings that are lost, obscured, or distorted in work that either ignores questions of sexuality or attends only to hegemonic or heteronormative understandings of it, as Glenn Berger and Stephen Kruger put it in their recent collection of essays. Central to this project, which has more recently become known as queering, is the critical rereading of canonical works and reassessment of their dominant interpretations. Queer theorists in particular have trained their aim on various straightening impulses in the secondary literature. That is, interpretive techniques of heteronormativizing or at least reducing the queer potential of non-heteronormative expressions of desire. In the field of Persian studies, this work has just begun and we have a long road ahead. Here I want to focus on one particularly subtle example of interpretive straightening, which occurs in many scholarly treatments of medieval Sufi hagiographic materials. It is, as Najma Badi has argued, the attenuation of medieval Sufi homoeroticism by, quote, reconfiguring it as purely allegorical and transcendental, something that can be enjoyed metaphorically and not to be confused with the real. This allegorization and transcendentalization of Sufi homoeroticism, I will argue, occurs primarily through the mutually reinforcing disembodiment and desexualization of Sufi erotic practices in much modern scholarship. In such accounts, forms of Sufi love play, ishq bazi, with real, even if imagined, bodies, are reduced to a recondite theory of the appreciation of beautiful metaphoric forms, so abstract, in fact, that the gender of the object of desire has little to no real significance anymore. Operating at the level of Sufi theory, and laden with obscure philosophical terminology, such works use the Sufi assertion that earthly beloveds are only metaphoric, majazi bridges to the real divine beloved, as license to dismiss the importance of the body and the sex-gender regime inscribed upon it as irrelevant to such spiritual practices. The decision, you might say, to hurry across this metaphoric bridge of the world and its bodies, however, is an ideological one that I would argue is attributable to both disciplinary and heteronormative biases in modern Sufi and Persian literary studies. It is also in marked contrast to the majority of existing Sufi hagiographies, which focus a great deal on the embodied and gendered beloveds that these spiritual masters utilized as metaphoric bridges to the divine. In a deliberate move, I will foreground these bodies and the discourses of desire that center on them as a way of challenging the disembodied and desexualized manner in which Sufi eroticism is frequently treated. Like these biographical works, we need to linger in the queer space of these metaphoric bridges, where male Sufis engaged mostly male witnesses, shahids, and trainer beloveds in love play in their efforts to reach higher levels of divine love. Finally, I will conclude by arguing that this form of Sufi eroticism represents not a flight from sexuality, but a particular Sufi inflection of the prevailing regimes of sexual normativity current in the medieval Persianate world. The figure of the beautiful Qalandari boy in Iraq's biography is simultaneously a stock figure and the most important character in the narrative. Although highly stylized, like the beloved of the medieval Persian lyric, he is the locus of the poet's desire and a catalyst for all sorts of dramatic transformations in Iraq's behavior. It is his beauty that sets fire to Iraq's heart and catapults him beyond the territorial and spiritual confines of his local madrasa and mosque. While Iraq's predisposition to fall in love is a necessary precondition, it is the sight of the youth that first initiates an internal turmoil in Iraqi, the traditional pious Muslim, and then transforms him into a heedless lover on the rogue's path. In this respect, the youth in the above story is a functional character, playing a well-established role in Persian Sufi literature. He is the so-called metaphoric, majazi, trainer beloved for the young spiritual novice. In this capacity, he will help mature Iraq's love into the higher divine forms of love. The young Qalandar fulfills his duty well, as we subsequently learn in the Hagiography. He leads Iraqi all the way to India, where he eventually becomes a disciple of the great Sufi master Bahauddin Zakaria of Multan. Under the direction of this capable master, Iraqi reaches the highest levels of divine love, in no small part due to the erotic training he received during his time as lover of his first beloved, the Qalandar youth. The use of an earthly beloved or trainer, the use of an earthly beloved as a trainer for metaphoric bridge to or mirror of the divine beloved is part of a well-developed theoretical tradition in medieval Sufism. According to this school of thought, earthly love, ishq-e majazi, is a metaphor, majaz, for the real or divine love, and it functions, as it is often said, as a bridge to the real. El majaz qantarat el haqiqa. Metaphor is the bridge to the real, or reality. The infamous Sufi Ain al-Ghazat Hamadani, who is frequently cited on this point, recommends to his readers in the beginning of his first chapter treating passionate love, ishq, that if you do not have the Creator's type of love, at least once try to fall in love with a person so that the value of these words may be productive for you. Earthly love has a pedagogical function in his view. It trains the spiritual adepts in the ways of love and guides them to its more elevated levels. Rumi makes this latter point, quite explicit in a famous passage from the Masnavi as well, saying, whether being in love comes from this side or the other, eventually it will guide us to that side. Love is understood as a spectrum to these Sufi luminaries, and it is firmly anchored in the created world. The contiguity, even imbrication of earthly and divine love on this spectrum is what enables a Sufi master like Muhammad Zangi to counsel his readers in the Nuzhat al-Ashiqin that if a Sufi aspirant is not advancing on the spiritual path, then he should promptly be sent to the dilapidated wine house, the Kharabat, house of ill repute, where he can fall in love with a beautiful youth and thereby be trained to be a better lover of God, the real beloved. Zangi's advice is not atypical. It echoes similar points by Ain al-Ghazat, Rumi, Iraqi, and it is in fact a divinely sanctioned training technique according to medieval Sufi theorists. God, too, makes use of earthly beloveds to train and season his chosen lovers for higher forms of divine love. Ain al-Ghazat makes this point quite explicit in his discussion of the famous Arab lovers Layla and Majnun. Do you know why God placed all these veils on the path? God did so in order that the lover in his eye would become more seasoned, until it can bear encountering God without a veil. Dear one, Layla's beauty is bait placed in a trap. Do you know what the trap is? Since the eternal hunter wanted it to make a riding horse out of Majnun's form, and he was not yet ready, he meaning Majnun, was not yet ready to fall into the trap of eternal love's beauty, God ordered that a love of Layla make a riding horse of Majnun's form for a while, until he became seasoned enough through that love to bear the love of God. Have you not seen that when there is an excellent riding horse, worthy of none except the king, that first a horse trainer mounts it and breaks it in, transforming its wildness and stubbornness into tameness and reserve? In the spiritualized reading of the famous love story of Layla and Majnun, God employs Layla to season Majnun and break him in for himself. The trainer beloved, Layla, may not be the ultimate goal, but neither is she inconsequential in the affair. God uses her in her embodied form to spark the fire of love in Majnun and build its flames until Majnun has been cooked enough to be ready for real haqiqi love. Iraqi makes a similar point in his treatise on love theory, the Lama'at. Flouting the artificial confines of the modern regime of heterosexuality, Iraqi portrays God trapping the heart of King Mahmud with the charms of his beautiful slave Ayaz. Love is a bride's color-mixing beautician that paints truth in the colors of metaphor, majaz. It beautifies with its comb the tresses of Ayaz so as to trap the heart of Mahmud. God, love, becomes a cosmetologist in these lines, patiently adorning Ayaz and his flowing locks in hopes that the desire his beauty will evoke in Mahmud will eventually guide him to love for God. Araqi's image here is particularly instructive. It foregrounds in an unforgettable way God as hairdresser and matchmaker for the most famous same-sex lovers in Islamic culture, the radical spiritual potency of even the most superficial elements of the human form. The centrality and pedagogical potential of the human body in the cosmic love affair between God and his Sufi lovers is not a view that comes naturally to researchers inculcated with broadly Cartesian assumptions of the modern world. It is not, however, problematic for medieval Sufis. They value the bodies of these earthly trainer beloveds precisely for their immediate perceptibility to even the most base spiritual aspirants. This point comes through especially clear in the earthly love or beloved as toy metaphor that several Sufi figures employ to explain the Sufi perspective on the earthly divine love spectrum. Rumi and Zangi, for example, both compare earthly love or beloveds to the toy sword a father gives to his son in order that he may practice with it and prepare himself for the real battles of adulthood. Rumi advises his readers that they should consider it a gift from God that you have experienced afflictions in love's quarters. Pass beyond metaphoric, majazi love. The final destination of love is God. The fighter gives his son a wooden sword, so he will become a master of it and then take the sword into real battles. Love for humans is the wooden sword in the matter of love. When you have become entangled at the end of love's path, that love will be transformed into love for God. In the beginning, for years, Zulekha's love was for Yusuf, but in the end, it became love for God, and it made her turn away from Yusuf. Rumi's brief excursus on Majazi love and the role of earthly trainer beloveds is telling on a number of levels. He clearly gives a positive valuation to earthly metaphoric forms of love, instructing readers to regard it as a blessing or gift from God, and then proceeds to illustrate its pedagogical utility through the images of the toy sword and the famous lovers Yusuf and Zulekha. He tells us that although the final destination of love for Sufis should be God, earthly love and beloveds play a critical role in the spiritual journey. Love for humans is the wooden sword in the matter of love, as he says. One could read this metaphor as trivializing earthly love, as many modern scholars have, either implicitly or explicitly. However, this is a misinterpretation. The earthly beloved as toy image conveys in the most tender and familiar terms the naturalness and the necessity of the embodied experience of love for Sufi spirituality. Ishq Bazi, literally love play, as many Sufi theorists term this practice, is in modern pedagogical terms a type of play-based experiential learning, which the earthly beloved functions as a scaffold, for the divine instructor, God. Rumi concretizes this point through the example of Yusuf and Zulekha. He tells us, without even a hint of judgment, that it was only by starting out on the path of love with her earthly beloved Yusuf that Zulekha came to truly love God. In fact, it was only after engaging in love play with him for years, as Rumi says, that she had matured enough to cross the metaphoric bridge and reach real divine love. And that is okay, Rumi, adopting the demeanor of spiritual father, seems to be saying. Just as children on the path of love must learn to play war with their wooden swords first before being sent into battle, so too must lovers play with an earthly beloved or two before being worthy of engaging in ishq-bazi with God. In any case, as Ain al-Ghazat and Iraqi indicate above, it is likely God who is playing the role of matchmaker in this affair, employing the peerless beauty Yusuf to season and break in Zulekha for himself. If these trainer beloveds' bodies are God's own instructional aids, should we really dismiss or trivialize them as just toys in the pejorative sense of that English phrase? I wouldn't suggest it. It is true that Rumi, like other Sufi figures, does open his discussion of earthly love and trainer beloveds by pushing the reader to pass beyond metaphoric majazi love to the real divine form of love of God. However, the exhortation to pass beyond should not be interpreted as license to disregard the embodied bridge to divine love or its physical form. It is understandable how it could be interpreted this way, but it does not square well with the existing Sufi literature. None of the Sufis discussed above, nor the Sufi hagiographic accounts we'll look at later, exhibit the compulsion to rush across the bodily bridge that guides and pushes their saintly subjects along love's spectrum to the final destination of love. And in fact, many of them openly celebrate the spiritual efficacy of embodied forms at great length and focus intensely on the physical beauty of the trainer beloved's body. Nowhere can this be seen as clearly as in the Sufi ritual of shahid bazi, literally witness play, which in a way can be understood as a ritualized form of the love play of Sufi saints and earthly trainer beloveds described above. In theory, it was a meditative technique in which Sufis would gaze at a beautiful human being, termed a witness, a shahid, who served in this ritual context as a reflection or a likeness of God's limitless beauty manifested in a visible phenomenal form. While frequently only discussed in these abstract theoretical terms, it was a historic practice that counted amongst its proponents some of the most illustrious Sufis of the medieval period, including Al-Ghazali, Ahmad al-Ghazali, Ain al-Ghazat, Ruzbehan Bakli, Kermani, and the primary focus of this talk, Fakhruddin Iraqi. According to its proponents, it was an unparalleled spiritual catalyst for the Sufi aspirant in their quest to reach the higher levels of divine love. The shahids that these Sufis employed in this ritual were equally historical as well. They were fleshy, corporal human beings chosen for their role above all others for their extraordinary physical beauty. Ain al-Ghazat is insistent on this point, emphasizing to his readers in a number of places that the metaphoric shahid, the shahid majazi, must have a beautiful face. The external beauty of the shahid is, in almost all accounts, the only qualification necessary for the role in this ritual. They could theoretically be either male or female. However, more often than not, they are portrayed as male use in Sufi theoretical treatises, poetry, and biographical literature. Some Sufis even went as far as to claim prophetic precedent for their preference for male use in this ritual, citing a number of prophetic traditions, hadith, in which Prophet Muhammad reportedly indicated that God appeared to him as a beardless male youth, an amrad. In the following section, we'll see a representative example of how shahid bazi is presented in Sufi hagiographic literature. But what I want to emphasize here is the way in which shahid bazi ritualized the use of bodies for spiritual purposes. In this practice, the body of a beautiful person becomes the primary pedagogical tool for progressing to the divine side of love's spectrum, for getting over the metaphoric bridge to real love. It can also, it can so effectively function as an instructional scaffolding for love because of its unique capacity to embody, to the greatest extent possible, the limitless beauty of God. This is a powerful statement about the importance of embodiment in medieval Sufism, and this leads me to my final point in this section. The centrality of the body in medieval Sufism, I would argue, makes the traditional translation of majaz and majazi as metaphor or metaphoric, respectively, somewhat misleading, even if technically defensible. Although accurate in a philosophical sense, metaphor and metaphoric do not adequately capture the full meaning of this term in medieval Sufi thought. Majaz has a much richer meaning in Sufi texts than we typically understand by the word metaphor in contemporary English. As the preceding discussion makes clear, majaz could just as accurately be translated as embodiment, because according to medieval Sufis, the entire phenomenal world and all of its forms are majazi. They may be metaphoric in a philosophical sense, but in reality they are bodies. Perhaps in this context, we should render the famous phrase, metaphor or the metaphoric is the bridge to reality, as embodiment is the bridge to reality. I would argue this translation better captures the full meaning of the term in medieval Sufi thought, and it also has the virtue of semantically foregrounding and re-embodying Sufi spirituality. It makes it more difficult to reduce the majazi, trainer, beloveds, and shahids rife throughout Sufi works to the status of metaphor. And here you should read metaphor as unreal or disembodied alone. It encourages us to fully reckon with them in all of their bodily particularities as the ineluctable flesh and blood bridge to the divine. Let me now return to the Hagiography of Eralqi. The story of Eralqi's erotic apprenticeship under the Qalandari trainer beloved that I opened this talk with is the most famous story in his hagiographic tradition. It is not anomalous, however. It is only the first of an interrelated series of homoerotic anecdotes that celebrate the spiritual utility of earthly beauty. These stories are interesting as much for what they do not say as for what they do say. Their foci, objects of censure, and implicit textual assumptions all provide important insights to the discursive construction and policing of desire in medieval Persianate Sufism. The one that I want to focus on in the remainder of this talk occurs during Eralqi's short stay in Cairo on his escape route from Tuqat to Damascus. He comes into close contact with the Sultan of Cairo while attempting to flee his former patron, Amir Parvaneh's son, while attempting to free his former patron, Amir Parvaneh's son, who has been imprisoned there by the Mamluks. After a series of impressive exhibitions of his high spiritual status, the Sultan of Cairo grows so impressed with Eralqi that he gives him a daily allowance and names him the chief sheikh of Cairo. Eralqi is back on top of the world after losing his Sufi lodge and nearly his life just weeks earlier due to his connection to the suspected traitor Amir Parvaneh. However, events quickly take a turn for the worse once again. Friends of the Sultan, as they are later referred to, inform him that Eralqi has taken a particular liking to the beautiful son of a local shoemaker in the Cairo market. One day, he, Eralqi, was passing through the shoe market and his gaze fell upon a boy, a Pesar. He became enamored with him. He went to him and said hello and asked the shoemaker, "Whose boy is this?" The shoemaker said, "He is my boy." The sheikh stretched out his hand and grabbed the lips of the boy and replied, "Is it not oppression that a mouth, lips, and teeth such as these are the companion of leather?" The shoemaker replied, "We are poor people, and our craft is this. If his teeth do not tear leather, they won't eat bread." The sheikh asked him, "How much does this boy earn per day?" He replied, 4 dirham per day. The sheikh ordered, "I will give him 8 dirhams per day, and he must not do work like this anymore." Every day the sheikh would go with his friends and sit in the shop and gaze at him, the boy, without a care in the world, recite poetry, and cry. Drawing on the trope of the beautiful artisan youth, the anonymous biographer portrays Eralqi here as stopped in his tracks while passing through the market when his glance, nazar, falls upon the beautiful son, Pesar, of a shoemaker. Not content to just appreciate such beauty from afar, he actually grabs the youth's face, imploring the father not to oppress the possessor of such fine beauty with this vulgar work. The father, present for the duration of the story, replies by citing their poverty and the need for the boy's labor. His response does not evince any particular concern with Aralki's erotic interest in the youth. It only expresses a practical reality of their peasant life. His son might be beautiful, but unless his beauty is helping the family eat, he must work leather. The father's plaintive response, whether intended this way or not, is read by Aralki as an indirect request for remuneration for the use of his son. Aralki pledges to pay his father almost twice as much as he earns the family daily if he is freed from such menial work and put at his disposal. The work the youth is to do in exchange for Aralki's patronage is not made explicit in the negotiations. All involved seem to intuitively understand what Aralki wants with the boy. But we soon learn that the father accepted Aralki's offer, and his son is now serving as the new shahid for Aralki's Sufi entourage. Up to this point in the anecdote, there are no indications that anything is amiss. Even the father's response to Aralki's entreaties registers no alarm. But this does not last long. Like the critics of Aralki's erotically charged spiritual sessions in Multan, Tukat, and Damascus, stories which I can't discuss here, but I treat at length elsewhere, opponents, literally accusers, Modaiyan, report to the Sultan that Aralki has been cavorting with a beautiful youth in the market. These friends of the Sultan attempt to dislodge this foreign upstart from the Sultan's good graces with a classic smear campaign. They seize the opportunity presented by Aralki's flamboyant display of love for the shoemaker's son in the middle of the Cairo market to raise doubts about his moral rectitude and spiritual sincerity. Such is the intensity of the social anxiety produced by the proximity of beautiful young males and older men that they assume even just these rumors will be sufficient cause for his speedy dismissal from the Sultan's inner circle. Although there are several other similar stories in Aralki's Hagiography, this story is particularly important because the way the anonymous author develops the remainder of the anecdote illustrates clearly for the first time the cause of the anxiety that has haunted this and similar stories of Aralki's erotic spiritual practices throughout this hagiography. The Sultan, in his interrogation of the opponents, is concerned with ascertaining one fact and only one fact. The opponents conveyed this news to the Sultan, that is, Aralki's practice of shahid-bazi with the shoemaker's son. He, the Sultan, responded by asking them, "Does he take this boy with him at night or not?" They replied, "No." He asked, "Does he take this boy into private quarters in the shop?" They replied, "No." He then requested an ink pot and pen and wrote, "Give the servants of Sheikh Aralki 5 additional dinars per day beyond the allotted amount." He sent it to the royal registrar's office, the Divan, so they were recorded in the royal records. The king's companions thought that it was a dismissal letter. When its contents were revealed, they lost hope and did not have any other opportunities to impugn Aralki's character. The point that the Sultan is driving at in this line of questioning is the issue of sexual improprieties. This is what has evoked the constant surveillance and suspicion of Aralki throughout his biography. The Sultan wants to know if Aralki is really a spiritual master or just a licentious charlatan using the Sufi technique of meditating on earthly embodiments of beauty as a cover for his illicit sexual affairs. A real Sufi master worthy of a place at his court would never engage in the latter. However, and this is crucially important, implicit too in the Sultan's response is that he sees nothing morally problematic about the practice of shahid-bazi or the love and desire evoked by the young male's beauty that is its spiritual catalyst and fuel. Nothing in the story evinces even the slightest discomfort with this same-sex desire in and of itself. And in fact, when the opponents concede that Aralki has not attempted to orchestrate any opportunities for illicit sexual contact by taking the youth into more private quarters, the Sultan blesses the spiritual power of homoerotic desire in his exoneration of Aralki and increase in his allowance. The Sultan's ultimately positive attitude towards this very public display of same-sex desire would not have surprised a medieval or early modern reader in the Islamicate world. They likely would have assumed from the beginning that the pervasive anxiety evinced throughout his hagiography about his homoerotic spiritual practices was related to the issue of sexual improprieties, not the gender of the object of desire. Medieval critics of Shahid-Bazi, both within and outside of Sufi circles, disapproved of this erotic meditative practice because they viewed it as exceedingly dangerous temptation to the body at best, and possibly just a lightly veiled way to indulge in sensual pleasure under pious pretenses. The famous Sufi critic Ibn Jawzi makes this point in his critique of Shahid-Bazi. In the view of legal scholars, gazing is forbidden in Islamic law, haram, for anyone whose sexual desire, shahvat, is excited by gazing at male youth, amradan, and any human who claims that their desire is not excited when gazing at a beautiful male youth, an amrad, is a liar. In his view, Shahid-Bazi would naturally elicit lust, shahvat, in almost all of its male participants, and could even put the most pious in danger of committing sexual acts illicit in the framework of Islamic law. While his criticism of Shahid-Bazi is frequently cited, the point he makes that is not discussed in the secondary literature is that he also boldly asserts the naturalness of same-sex desire in his prohibition of the practice. Without even a hint of heteronormative discomfort, he incredulously says to the Sufis who claim that such young males excite no sexual desire, shahvat, in them, "It is not possible, you are lying. How could you not be sexually aroused after catching sight of such a beautiful young male?" To slightly rephrase his final qualification above. The traditionalist and straight-edge Islamic jurist even implicitly indicates in this curt universal qualification that he himself is attracted to young males. The desire itself is completely natural in his view. It is the assumed naturalness and near universality of this erotic response that makes the critics of Shahid-Bazi like him so vociferously opposed to it. Just as Islamic law enjoins women to dress modestly and men to avert their gazes from them in order to prevent the excitation of lust, so too, Ibn Jawzi maintains, must men avert their gazes from young males. They are equally natural objects of desire for older males, and Shahid-Bazi's ritualized gazing at them is problematic for this reason. Proponents of Shahid-Bazi, as we've seen in the theoretical discussions and anecdotes above, do not dispute that desire of some sort is the natural bodily response of an older male to the body of a beautiful young male. However, they claim that the form of desire that they experience upon sighting a beautiful youth is not carnal sexual desire, shahvat, but a chaste, higher form of desire called love of the heart, or erotic love, ishq, passionate love perhaps. Kermani, a well-known practitioner of Shahid-Bazi and the master of Iraq's second master, Konawi, is uncompromising on the nature of desire involved in genuine Shahid-Bazi. Insofar as the way and style of spiritual realization is concerned, Shahid-Bazi is the practice of all righteous ones. Whoever gazes at a shahid with sexual desire is not truthful in his claim. He is an infidel to us. No one should confuse sexual desire with erotic love, ishq. Kermani asserts in another poem that reads like an angry response to critics such as Ibn Jawzi, who do not understand the fine distinctions between different types of desire. What a waste if you think erotic love, ishq, to be base sexual desire. Shame on you, for you are going very far astray. Erotic love is the water of life of both worlds. How can you call it the fire of sexual desire? Sufi lovers like Kermani contend that this form of desire is not fundamentally sexual, shafani, but rather has somehow been sublimated into a higher, more pure form, ishq, that is not only spiritually catalytic, but indeed, as he says, the water of life of both worlds. It is this distinction that the author of Iraq's Hagiography attempts to capture in the Sultan's line of questioning above. He wants the reader to understand that although Iraqi may be an unabashed connoisseur of male beauty, he is a profligate Sufi lover, ashiq, not a lecher out to engage in sexual improprieties. True Sufi lovers like Kermani, Ain al-Ghuzat, and Iraqi would not, after all, disagree with Ibn Jawzi when he asserts that gazing is forbidden in Islamic law for anyone whose sexual desire is excited by it. They would even agree that desire is the inevitable is inevitably and naturally evoked in any onlooker when they look upon beautiful use, Amra Dawn. But, Passé Ibn Jauzi, they insist that desire comes in more than one form, and as Kermani admonishes above, what a waste if you think erotic love to be base sexual desire. Shame on you, for you are going very far astray. In the estimation of Sufi proponents of this view, the distinction between these two forms of desire renders illicit the elaborate celebrations of homoeroticism rife throughout Persian Sufi poetry and hagiography. However, not all were so easily convinced. Many questioned the tenability of this theoretical distinction in praxis. Even some prominent Sufi figures did not believe it possible for a human being to completely extricate themselves from the matrix of natural bodily responses through spiritual efforts. It is not surprising, then, that Sufi eroticism and its related practices became a hotly contested site of discourse in the medieval period. Sufis responded on all generic fronts in this discursive war of name that desire. Theoretical treatises and poetry played an important role in this debate, but Sufi hagiography arguably played an even more powerful role because of its intense generic focus on bodies. Portraying the ideal performance of Sufi eroticism by leading Sufis such as Iraqi, these accounts seek to construct, defend, and police this exceedingly dangerous yet highly productive form of embodied desire that can either catapult its practitioners to the peaks of spiritual insight or lead them to the depths of carnal abasement. The anecdotes discussed above from Iraqi's hagiographic tradition are representing examples from this voluminous literature, but they are only the tip of the iceberg. There are other similar stories in Iraqi's hagiography, to say nothing of the accounts of numerous other medieval Sufi figures, such as Al-Ghazali, Kermani, etc., who figure prominently in discussions of Sufi eroticism. The repeated bodily performance of correct erotic practice in these hagiographic works militates against efforts to reduce this Sufi construct of desire to a disembodied or philosophical love of beautiful forms, as it is often termed in modern scholarship. In Sufi theory, it may indeed be a desire for a beautiful metaphoric form, but in the phenomenal world of medieval Persianate lands, this form was most frequently a young male's body. The hagiographies of Iraqi and other Sufi lovers do not evince any ambivalence on this point, and indeed they foreground these embodied Majazi bridges to the divine in their unabashed celebration of homoerotic desire as a spiritually and poetically productive force. They help us, as scholars operating within the modern academy's invisible heteronormativity, to re-embody the markedly queer figure of the beloved and reposition Sufi homoeroticism as one of the primary cultural deployments of sexuality in the Islamicate world. Re-embodied, Sufi eroticism no longer looks so much like a flight from sexuality, but rather a distinct Sufi inflection of it. A Sufi regime of sexual normativity, if you will, that sought to harness human sexuality's full range of potentialities for spiritual ends, even if condemning its physical actualization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was brilliant. I have time for a little bit of a few questions. I would like to actually start with one. I'm always curious. The way it's been sort of encouraged in modern times is that the standard of beauty in the Islamic world tends to be, shown or portrayed more and more through a beauty of a woman. Would you say that this is more of a modern phenomena, and that when did this start, and how much of this beauty of a youth was really genderless? Mm-hmm. And how much of it was more homoerotic, and how has that evolved? That's one thing. On language, Persian and Turkish don't have male or female, so they're gender-free. So the language is more ambiguous in poetry. And so people reading the poems, a modern person can then assume that it's the opposite sex versus the same sex. But in a language like Arabic, in which you have clear gender, does it make a difference, or is Arabic Sufi poetry much more, precise? Mm-hmm. And that's it.
Thank you for those questions. I'll do my best to touch on all of them. First of all, the question of the language. It is true Persian pronouns are not gendered. I would argue, following several other major scholars, in that the ideal beloved, the figure of beauty in the medieval period at least, is usually in poetry a young male, basically right on the edge of adolescence. There are discussions about this. I think that the weight of the evidence, even when the gender is not indicated, would push the reader to assume it's male unless told otherwise, basically, within the poem. That's kind of what I operate on in terms of the way I approach it. There are people who have different opinions. To address your first question, I think that some point in the 19th century, as discourses of modern sexuality, what people like Foucault and Halperin talk about as kind of the discourse of sexuality, when sexuality in Europe becomes a psychological identity, something that's innate within the person. When those discourses start coming into the Middle East in the 19th, early 20th century, all of a sudden, as Najma Badi brilliantly chronicles in her work, she actually uses this great term. She says the pre-modern beloved has to be closeted. Basically, the young male beloved has to go and be put back in the closet and kind of covered over and be reduced, as I said, be reduced to this kind of metaphoric thing that does not have a real corresponding body to it. This occurs in the 19th, 20th century, and I think that it's part of this broader these discourses of modernity that kind of start coming into the Middle East at this time. So there's a lot of great books out there that I can recommend.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Mary Jane.
No, I just wanted to continue on the question that because it made me think of the question that you wrote, and your answer was that you're right, it's more a 19th and 20th century phenomenon, because if you look at Greek sculpture or Roman sculpture, etc., it's the youth, the man is as are women, but the man certainly plays a major role in terms of beauty. And then in terms of the Arabic language, it's true it's more precise, but it's interesting that, for example, in addressing forms of love or in song in Arabic, we do it in the male, using the word, the male gender, even when you're addressing a woman. And Arabic songs use the masculine in songs which are clearly addressed to women. So it's an interesting concept. So even when it's more precise, it chooses the language chooses the main form.
And it's well, let me just comment on one thing. I didn't really talk about this in this talk, but this ideal of beauty, kind of the male youth that's like right on the cusp of adolescence, is coming out of the broader kind of basically ancient Near East ideas, Greco-Roman ideas of beauty. And it really has to be read in that context, I think.
Go ahead. Actually, yeah, Dr. Keshavarz, you have two more over there. Go ahead, Simon.
I just wanted to say that the beloved, the ooh, is in fact far more spacious than that. It has components of the divine. It could be the mamluk, the king who supports you. It could be the female beloved or the male beloved. And I'm very aware as I speak that I'm a child of the training that came out of the 20th century, so very much for us, it would have been, the literary training would have been the putting of their old beloved into their closet and looking at the female. But at the same time, I want to say that probably one of the most significant aspects of this is the spaciousness of this figure. And the fact that it could simultaneously
multiple things.
Mhm.
yes, have multiple, both poetic but also realistic in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent point. I mean, the figure of the beloved in each poem actually in different performance contexts can go in different ways, too. In one performance context, it could be the mamdu, it could be the patron, who could be male. In another performance context, it could switch and be used for a female beloved, which is actually, in and of itself, kind of interesting. I've often toyed with this idea of Persian eroticism. Eroticism in Persian poetry is ambierotic, basically being able to go both ways. So that's a.
Go ahead, you had a question, and then maybe you're next.
Yes, I laud your erudition and obvious mastery of this topic, of which I know absolutely nothing. But I asked you one simple question, and then a more complex question. You mentioned the biography by Chitter and Riddick.
Chittick and Wilson. I think it was published in like 1984 or something. Yeah, I think it's like 1984. It's in the St. Paul's series of spiritual masters. Yeah.
My other question, and I don't put this to be argumentative, but in the sense of academic debate. I'll be honest, not your position, but in your description of this historical approach to it, it strikes me as a very erudite, specific disputation from an academic standpoint that, we're talking about, desire and in a very lofty sense. We wouldn't dare sully this with, the filth of humanity. Frankly, I find that rather ludicrous. Were there people at the time in medieval periods who found it ludicrous, and are there people today who find it ludicrous? What is can you give a consensus of what is the acceptance of this position?
Yes, I mean, I think actually in some ways we may be more on the same page than you think. I mean, what I'm trying to do is say, let's re-embody these forms of desire. Let's not just talk about them as it is in the theoretical tradition and it is in much modern scholarship as this kind of abstract, highly philosophical thing where you're just talking about loving beautiful forms and all this. I'm actually trying to read through the hagiographic tradition and say, look, even Sufi figures writing about this clearly understand these beautiful forms as bodies that are gendered, that have a gender, that are part of the kind of.
Well, I think Freud would indicate, maybe I bring up a wonderful view, but the impossibility of cleaving the psyche to that high degree of this is in one box, this is in another box, and never the twain shall meet. I can't accept.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Sufi figures them. I just mentioned this in passing, but Sufi figures themselves actually critique this idea that you can have this, ishq, this purely spiritual erotic desire that's completely separated from, what they would refer to as shafat, lust, this kind of base. So there's Sufi critics of this view, I think is what you're saying. There's Sufi critics that say, you can't really do this. There's this one story in the medieval period, yeah.
You would want to make a quick comment and then.
Yes, I wanted to answer, this is not only Sufism or in Islam, that in fact Catholicism has this when it talks about the mysticism of saints. Think about nuns going as brides of God. The idea of the mystical experience of being married to God. The concept, again, is a concept of the body and mysticism, which does not necessarily end into a physical act, but the body is present, and it is it is at a higher level of the mystical, where love becomes embodied in God, but is in a way gendered by the concept of being a nun and married to God. So it is there in the religion in itself. You know, this concept of the body and the soul and the mysticism without an act. Yeah.
Let me also, she's been very patient. Go ahead. You asked the question. Go ahead.
So going off of what you were saying with the gender role and how you mentioned about Europeans or Westerners coming into the movies and reading these poems, my question is, how did that affect their translation, and also what was their point of view about this gender role within the poems and the poetry, and also the miniatures, as you know, the paintings and miniatures, they were also painted. And I want to see how the Europeans, what their perspective was about these poems.
Yeah, this is a good question. I must admit, I've not done a full study of all the kind of translation history of these different things. But in general, you have different translators handle it in different ways. You have somebody like Ritter, one of the great Orientalists, who's very direct, actually, about this. And his kind of like work, I believe that's from like 1955, is still, if you're going to research this area, is still kind of one of the main places you go to. There's quite a large gap in between that and the next like treatment of this that does a really serious look at homoeroticism. I would say that it's a mixed bag, honestly. You have some translators who translate the beloved as masculine because they view it as kind of coming out of the Greek tradition, and they're a lot of times classicists themselves. They were trained in Greek and Latin, and so they view it as coming out of that kind of ancient Near East tradition that did see the kind of the adolescent male as the height of beauty. There's other ones who change it, who change it to feminine in order to basically, make it more digestible by their audiences.
And in continuation of that, it's not only the homoerotic, almost any erotic reference in these works is problematic frequently for European translators. I mean, an example of that is the famous Nicholson's translation of the Masnavi, and he usually uses Latin when he gets to these areas, but he finds it difficult to express these in English. So I think there is quite a bit of that duality that you were talking about, the mind-body separation that affects that. If I may just add one more quick comment, I think the idea, and this is more to the gentleman who spoke earlier about, I think the idea is really to enter this debate into the literary discourse. It's not, you're not really, to my understanding, deciding what is the right final answer, but you're basically saying this important aspect has been closeted, and it takes away so much from the richness of this literature that offers us new ways of understanding it. So it's more opening it in rather than quoting.
Yeah.
Dr. Karim
And it
Mustafa?
was open before.
Yes.
That's the interesting
Yeah.
thing.
And it's
That
closed
it was
down.
open at earliest time, both in the West and in the East.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That such discussions were taking place, and they're much more narrow.
Now,
This is why I've talked about it as re-embodying, because I think that it's something that we need to recover. It's not something, it existed. So, I'm sorry.
Dr. Karim Mustafa, go ahead.
Yes, so excellent talk. I enjoyed it. I like this movie, and I really love the embodiment. And also, it has a great translation, perhaps, of Hagiography in this particular context. I do want to press you a bit on your translation of Ish as erotic.
Yeah.
Because what I understand, your impulse probably is to make sure that the erotic is included in that love, which is perfectly understandable, and I think I agree with you on that score. But when you call it erotic love, as opposed to perhaps passionate love, then you run the risk of basically exclusively directing attention to the erotic dimension of that love,
Yeah.
as opposed to all the other dimensions. And the whole point about Ish kind of like love. And erotic really sort of runs the risk of narrowing down,
Yeah.
even though your intention, as I take it, to be direct our attention to the fact that the erotic should not be excluded. It's
Right.
in fact the kind of love that is perhaps triggered by a sublimated erotic desire, in the case of the figures that you cited. So that's what I wanted to press you on.
Yeah, I actually realize that I switch back and forth between this erotic and passionate. So I think I'm displaying willfully or not my ambivalence on that translation. But yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much for raising that, which is really the second question of the question and answer. Every other question was this gender. I thank you for mentioning that. I think ishq is just love, and the ambiguity is there. In your other translations too, I thought perhaps an inadvertent desire to over-sexualize, Kamkhar, to translate as bosom body, is a bit of a stretch.
Okay.
Both Ram and Khar are really caring things, caring individuals, individuals who care for you.
Commiserator, fellow
Yeah.
commiserator.
Bosom body,
Commiserator, yeah.
embody it and sexualize it in a way. And there were other instances. So go over your translations again and see whether the way you might yourself be oriented towards interpretation and veering away from what Fatima says, which really is just presenting the case rather than judging it. I think it would be good for you to look at your translations again with that in mind.
Okay. Yeah. Oh.
On the word Ramkhar, though, I don't know if you're going on Arabi because he does have a very specific beloved interpretation that in the famous ghazals that I want you to be my Ramkhar, he brings it very close to a kind of a
Erotic,
romantic.
Yeah, I will definitely take a look at those, and maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I'd be interested. Which
Any
other?
questions? Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Great question, Maggie. Thank you very much. All right.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.